Hello everyone, welcome to our first online lecture on computer network security. Before we start, I hope you and your families are doing well. I hope you are staying safe. I hope you are practicing social distancing. Um, I do have a piece of advice to offer before we start. Obviously, these are uncertain times, and we don't know when or if things will return to normal anytime soon. And so I do hope that you will take this time to study well, learn about things that might be of interest to you. This might come handy when we return to normal because it could be the case that we will not have a lot of time to do everything that we have planned. And so it would be nice if you can exploit this opportunity now to learn as much as you can. Second thing is, I do recognize that this period might actually be overwhelming to many of you, and so I would like to offer my help in anything. If you feel that you want to discuss something and if you feel overwhelmed, just shoot me a message on Facebook Messenger and I'll be glad to chat. The topic of today is blockchains. So up to this point, we have been learning only about fundamental security concepts. We have learned symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. We have learned about modes of encryption, hash functions, message authentication codes, and we got an idea about what a digital signature is, even though we haven't seen an actual algorithm to do it. For the second half of the semester, we will actually be focusing on applications of these cryptography techniques. And today is going to be our first application, blockchains. So I started teaching blockchains 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, it was actually the Bitcoin hype. That was when the Bitcoin prices started to take off. And many people were interested in investing in cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is one of them, Ethereum is another. There were actually many applications that people tried to invest in. And it was also the year that people were starting to get interested in something called mining, which we will discuss in this lecture or the next one. I would say before we start talking about blockchains that the hype has gone mostly. So the investments in blockchains are reduced and interest is not as it was 2 years ago. So even though the interest in blockchains has reduced, it is still a very important security application. And it could be the case that in the future there would be what is called a killer application that would make blockchains actually take off and become very interesting in the future. But even if this doesn't happen, it's an interesting security application that shows us how we can actually combine many of the cryptography and security techniques that we have learned to achieve something. And so before we start talking about what blockchains are, let's actually talk about the motivation behind them. So the first Bitcoin application was, the first blockchain application was Bitcoin, and it came around 2008. And so what was the motivation behind it? Before Bitcoin, banking systems were done in a very traditional way. So there have been actually forms of banking systems dating all the way back to 2040 BC, where we find something called the balance sheet that basically just records a set of financial transactions. Obviously, this evolved a great deal. You have banks that actually came in the 19th century. We have the invention of the computer, obviously, by Alan Turing in 1936, and then you have many different banking applications and different ways to do financial transactions leading up to 2008, where we find the first blockchain application, which is Bitcoin. Other blockchain applications have also emerged, such as Ethereum, that actually allows you to do more than just financial transactions, as we will learn. So why did Bitcoin come out? What was the motivation behind it? Well, basically, let's first start by seeing what do banks do. Basically, when you want to do a financial transaction, let's say you want to transfer $100 from Alice to Bob, what is the role of the bank? Obviously, if you have this amount in cash and you take this cash and you give it to Bob, this transaction is then verified. This is a direct transaction. Bob can then just look at the $100 bill, and for example, by seeing the watermark or something like that, they can verify that this 100 bill is authentic, and then this financial transaction is executed. But if you do this financial transaction through a bank, what does the bank do? The bank actually performs a series of checks. First of all, is this transaction valid? The bank would like to validate that you would indeed want to transfer $100 to Bob. So there would be a series of checks. If you're doing this online, then there could be cryptography and security checks that would verify that you are the person who indeed would like to transfer this exact amount of money to Bob. So this validation would ensure that your identity is correct and the amount of money that you want to transfer is correct as well. That's the first step. Once the bank verifies that this transaction is actually valid, the bank has to check that you are capable of actually making this financial transaction. So before you can do any financial transactions, you would have to go to the bank and open an account. And you would have to deposit some money. Let's say you deposit, for example, $400, and over the course of time, you make a series of financial transactions. First, you pay someone, for example, $200. And so the bank would then deduct $200 from your account, and you'd have $200 left. Let's say at this point, you want to transfer $100 to Bob. So the bank will go to your account and make sure that you indeed have this much money left in your account. And so the bank would say, okay, then you can actually transfer this money to Bob. So in order for you to be able to do that, you have to be a customer of that bank. You have to go and open an account. You have to be a member of their system, and you have to deposit some money before you can actually do any transaction. That's a prerequisite. If you are going to transfer money to Bob's account, then Bob has to be a member of a bank as well. Bob has to have an account either in the same bank or in a different bank. In each case, Bob has to do this step beforehand as well. So these are the two steps that the bank does. There is also a third step, which is basically to check whether there are any other conditions for this transaction. Maybe the bank imposes, for example, some fees for each transaction. Maybe the bank doesn't allow all kinds of transactions. The bank basically makes the rules in this case, and you have to follow the rules of the bank if you become a customer of that bank. These are more or less the steps or the series of checks that the bank has to do before actually allowing this financial transaction. And if all the checks are passed, then the financial transaction is allowed and the money is transferred to Bob's account. Okay, so why are banks the default way of doing actually financial transactions? What makes them actually so important? Well, because they act as what we call a trusted arbiter. The trusted arbiter is basically an entity that people trust. What do we trust the bank with? We trust the bank that they keep our money safe, for example. This is actually what the status of the banks are now. It wasn't before, actually, when banks started to operate. If someone goes and robs your money from the bank, your money is gone. It wasn't actually until, I think, the 1930s where insurance started to keep your money safe. Basically, the government ensures that the bank will keep your money safe. So the bank is a trusted arbiter, and you trust the bank that they will keep your money safe, and you trust the bank that they will verify these transactions and do the steps that we have explained just now. What is the problem with having a trusted arbiter? Basically, the least is it's a single point of failure. If the trusted arbiter goes down, you are not able to do a financial transaction. That's why banks have it very difficult to take, for example, days off or take a vacation. They cannot close for extended periods of time because you rely on them to do any kind of financial transaction. So it's a single point of failure. There is a lot of reliability on that trusted arbiter to do any financial transaction. The other problem is, and this was actually the main motivation behind blockchains and cryptocurrencies, is the concentration of power. The trusted arbiter has full control. If the banks decides to impose, for example, additional fees, obviously you have the option to switch to another bank, but this other bank would also have the same power over you. they will be able to impose any kinds of fees you want, and as long as you're a customer of that bank, you would have to follow. They can also decide whether they will allow transactions or not. Obviously, the banks have an interest in allowing you to make as many financial transactions as you want, but it's really up to them. If they impose certain censorships on transactions or anything like that, they can actually prevent you from doing a certain financial transaction. They also control the history, and that's a very important aspect. They control, or they are responsible of maintaining what happens in your history. I'm sure you have come into this situation before, that someone, for example, hacks a credit card or something like that, and then they make a purchase, and then you go and complain to the bank and you say, well, I didn't make this purchase. Well, the bank has the responsibility to verify, and sometimes there are actually government checks to ensure that they do verify. But if the bank tells you that, yes, we have did our verifications and it turns out that you did actually make this financial transaction, there's really not much you can do. And so because the bank controls the history, the bank basically controls, or the trusted arbiter in this case, controls how much money you have in your account. Now, again, the bank has interest in keeping this money honest, in keeping the integrity of the amount that you have in your account correct, because if they don't do that, then they will no longer have customers. So there is mutual interest, and this is how the system keeps on going. But it did become a motivation for an alternative system, a system that doesn't rely on concentration of power, a system that doesn't rely on a trusted arbiter, basically a decentralized system, a system that everyone owns, and it only works because everyone participates in that system, as we will see. So this then becomes the motivation for blockchains. So what do we get with blockchains? What is actually a blockchain? A blockchain is nothing but a data structure. Basically, you store any kinds of data in the structure. It could be financial transactions, it could be something else. So each block in the blockchain contains some records. Let's say, for example, that these records are actually our financial transactions. What makes a blockchain special is that each block is then linked to the one before it. And the one before it also contains a series of records. And then it is also linked to the one before it. And then it's linked to the one before it, and so on until you reach the very first block. Okay? And this becomes what is called a ledger. So a ledger is basically the account that the bank keeps, except that instead of the bank, you have the blockchain. The blockchain actually now keeps your record. And the blockchain is the one that keeps the state of the system. We will see more details in a little bit, but this is the main idea. If everyone keeps the blockchain, then no one owns it, because now everyone can actually verify the status and verify the history of the system and take a look at what financial transactions or what records are actually available in the past. And so if it is public, and if they are linked in this way, then basically it becomes the replacement of the trusted arbiter. It becomes the decentralized arbiter in this case. So as we said, you can keep financial transactions in this blockchain, but you can keep actually anything. Any kind of data can be stored in a blockchain in this way. Okay, so as an example, we can actually play a game of chess using blockchains. Let's say you have this board to begin with, and let's say you want to start by moving this pawn 2 steps, for example. So the first step that you would record on the blockchain is you say, for example, E2 to E4. And then your opponent would start playing by saying, for example, E7 to E5. And then you would say, for example, knight, you want to move it from G1 to H3. And you can continue this way. And then you can save this information in a blockchain. Let's say each 3 moves are saved in a block in a blockchain. And then you have the next block stores another 3 moves, and this the next block is linked to the one before it. So this is block 1, this is block 2, block 3 would be linked to block 2, and so on. And so the idea of the blockchain is that you cannot manipulate a single block. If you want to manipulate block 3, because it is linked to the one before it, you have to manipulate block 2 as well, and then you have to manipulate block 1. I will show you how in a little bit. But without actually going into these details, you can see that if you want to play a game of chess using blockchains, basically you start with the initial point in history, which is the board and how the pieces are set on that board. Everyone knows how the pieces are set. There is no confusion there. There is no differences between one game of chess and the other into how the initial blocks are set. And so you start with that, and then you go into each block and you see what are the moves that have been made. And then you can actually trace. You can move the pieces one move after the other until you reach the current state of the system. And so if you go through all the moves in the blockchain, you will reach a step where this is actually the current state. So the blockchain in this case would allow you to keep the history of this game so that you can actually trace back and see what moves have been made and how did you reach the current step. You can do the same with financial transactions. Instead of chess moves, you have, for example, an initial value in your account. Let's say this value is $1,000. So you transfer 100, then you are left with $900. You transfer 200, then you are left with $700. And so the blockchain in this case would keep track of how much money you have spent, and so you can figure out how much money you have in your account in this case. So anyone who traces over these steps would be able to know what financial transactions you have made and if the current value that you're trying to transfer is valid or not, and if you have this money to transfer or not. Okay. So in the year of the Bitcoin hype, what happened is because the system became so popular, so many people wanted to use it. And so many people wanted to figure out what kinds of applications you can actually use with the blockchain. And there were so many research efforts, so many trials to use this blockchain system in different applications, not just actually in financial transactions, but in so many things. The result was is that there were actually trials to use blockchains where it wasn't so appropriate, or wasn't so suitable. As we will learn later, a blockchain system is actually a complicated one. It is difficult to maintain and it's expensive to actually maintain and to update. And so to use a blockchain, you have to be sure that your application requires this data structure. And so I would say you use a blockchain when two main issues become actually at hand. First of all, the members of the system don't trust each other. This is the case when you do financial transactions. If you want to do a transaction with a stranger, for example, you have no reason to trust this stranger. And so this is why you use the bank. The bank is the trusted arbiter. When you say you will transfer $100 to someone, this someone has no reason to trust you. But if the bank tells you that now you have $100 that have been deposited in your account, you would trust the bank. This is actually why we do financial transactions through the bank. But we use the blockchain if, for example, there are a group of people who don't trust each other and you want to have some dealings with each other. So the blockchain provides, as we said, the decentralized replacement of a trusted arbiter. And so we come at the second actually issue that we usually have when we use blockchains, which is the decentralized system. And so you use blockchains whenever you have a group of people that do not trust each other and they want to have a decentralized system. Basically, none of them is trusted enough to be actually the trusted arbiter. They want to keep everything decentralized. They want to have equal control over the system. So if they use the blockchain, as we said, they can agree on the history so that they can agree on the current state of the system so that they can do something or the other. Okay? So we get the functionality of a trusted arbiter without actually needing a trusted arbiter. And so in our course, we will use cryptocurrencies as the example of a blockchain application. It's currently the most viable example. It's the one that is used actively. And so this is going to be our main example for a blockchain application. So we start with the components of cryptocurrency. What are actually the components of a cryptocurrency? First of all, you have a group of developers that obviously develop this application and maintain it. You have a peer-to-peer network that is used to exchange the transactions. So you exchange the transactions online. Basically, it's something like an instruction, transfer $100 from this person to the next. And it is a peer-to-peer network because once you actually do a financial transaction, it is broadcasted all over this network. That's the idea, because you have a decentralized system. You don't want to broadcast this transaction just to one person, because then this one person would have control over what happens to this transaction. They would be the ones that decide whether this transaction is valid or not. And so in cryptocurrencies, you don't do that. You have a peer-to-peer network. Once someone does a financial transaction, this financial transaction is broadcasted all over the peer-to-peer network. And then you have something called miners. The miners are the ones that basically generate the blocks. We will see later that in some applications, such as Bitcoin, for example, this involves a lot of computational power. But in any case, the miners are the ones that are responsible for collecting these financial transactions that have been broadcasted through the network and making them into blocks and then adding these blocks into the blockchain. And because the miners are also decentralized, adding blocks to the blockchain is a decentralized system as well. It's actually a competitive system because in the cryptocurrency applications, if you get to add a block to the blockchain, this is when you get a reward. We will see this later. But for now, these are actually the components. You have members who basically own cryptocurrency, let's say Bitcoin, for example, and they can exchange this Bitcoin between each other. You don't have to be a miner to exchange Bitcoin or exchange cryptocurrency. Anyone can actually, if they have something called an online wallet, they can exchange cryptocurrency with anyone else. You do have to be a member of the peer-to-peer network, though, to exchange money, because once you make a transaction, as we said, you have to broadcast it through the peer-to-peer network. But the miners are actually the group of people who are responsible for maintaining and updating the blockchain, which is the ledger that we have. So, how do we secure decentralized payment? This is actually how, by having decentralized miners. We also want to know how do we build trust and how do we ensure privacy. Privacy is actually an issue that is special with cryptocurrency because this was actually one of the motivating aspects of cryptocurrencies, that people want to actually make transactions without having their identities exposed in this case. And we'll see how in a little bit. So we now go into a little bit more details. How do blockchains actually achieve these objectives? Well, they use a mixture of cryptography algorithms and clever technical solutions. This is actually why they are of interest to us. The cryptography algorithms that are actually used in a very innovative way that makes them interesting to study. And we will focus on 3 cryptography algorithms that are used in blockchains, and we will see how they are actually used. These 3 cryptography algorithms are hash functions, digital signatures, and something called Merkle trees. We will start with how hash functions are used in blockchains. So we have studied hash functions before. We said that hash functions are primarily used to achieve the security objective of integrity. So if you have a message and you want to send this message from a sender to a receiver, and you want the receiver to be able to verify that this message is true once it is received, that it has not been manipulated on its way, you take the message, you pass it through a hash function, and you generate the hash. And then you concatenate the hash with the message and send it. And so the receiver can do the same, can rehash the received message, and then compare the rehash with the hash that has been sent. If they match, then the integrity objective is achieved. Basically, this is done by assuming that the attacker will not be able to change the message and change the hash in a way such as the result would still match. And we said that to achieve that, there are actually many requirements for hash functions. We focused on 6 requirements that we say are actually key in so many different applications. Among them are the one-way property that makes sure that the hash function is not reversible, weak collision resistance, and strong collision resistance, which makes the hash function resistant to the birthday attack, as we explained. These are the main requirements of the hash functions. So how are hash functions actually used in cryptocurrencies? You can already imagine that if you want to send a financial transaction from one person to the other, you want to make sure that the amount that you insert in this financial transaction and your identity and all information actually that you include in this transaction is correct. So that if someone wants to validate this transaction, there is a way to validate it. And the way to validate it in cryptocurrencies is actually hash functions. By using hash functions, you can verify that the information in your transaction is correct. Now, one thing is, we know that hash functions are not 100% secure. Obviously, every hash functions, because it is a many-to-one transformation function, you can actually have several input messages that would result in the same output hash. And so, theoretically speaking, someone can find another financial transaction that would result in the same hash. For example, if you're transferring $100 through cryptocurrency, someone can find another message that, for example, transfers $1,000 or $1 million, but would have the same hash. Obviously, this is possible when you use hash functions, but as we said, it should be computationally difficult to find this alternative transaction or this alternative message that has the same hash. So this is more or less, or this is one of the uses for hash functions in cryptocurrencies, which is to protect the integrity of the blockchain. And the integrity of the blockchain implies the integrity of the underlying financial transactions that are included as well. And so in blockchains, you have the same requirements for the hash functions that you would have in many different other applications. The new thing is you have additional requirements for the hash functions to be used in blockchains. There are two main requirements that we need. They are called hiding and they are called puzzle friendliness. These are the two additional requirements that we need in blockchains, and these are the ones that we will study right now. So we start with hiding. What does it mean to have a hash function that has the hiding property? So a hash function H is hiding if when a secret value R is chosen from a probability distribution that has high minimum entropy, then given H of R concatenated with X, it is infeasible to find X. We read it again. A hash function H is hiding if when a secret value R is chosen from a probability distribution that has high minimum entropy, then given H of R concatenated with X, it is infeasible to find X. Basically, you have a value X that you are trying to hash, then you concatenate X with a value R, where R is a random value that is chosen from a distribution that has high minimum entropy. High minimum entropy more or less means that every value is just as likely as the other. Then if you concatenate R with X, you have the result, which is the hash of R concatenated with X, where it is infeasible to find X. This is actually the hiding property. Okay, what does it mean? As an example, we'll use the simple hash function that we have studied before, which is the XOR function. Okay, how does this work? Basically, as input, you take the data as a block and you arrange it into rows and columns. 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, for example, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, for example. And so the way this would work, as we said before, you take every column and you XOR it. And so this would be 0, this would be 1, this would be 1, 1, and 0. This result is the hash. This is the hash of your message. Okay, and then this is the one that is used. Obviously, we said that this is not secure. It achieves some of the properties of the hash function, but it doesn't achieve many others. For example, it produces a fixed size hash. And it is not easily reversible because this is what you would get. You would get 0, 1, 1, 1, 0. And this can be generated by any number of input values. This is especially true if the input is not restricted to a particular size. If you can have any arbitrary number of rows, then you can have any arbitrary number of possibilities that would generate the same hash. Okay? And by the way, if you restrict the number of columns, then you would have a fixed size hash. Okay, if let's say we restrict in this case the number of columns to 5 columns, then you would have a fixed size hash. The hash is always 5 bits. Okay, but you can have an arbitrary number of rows, and so the input can be of arbitrary size. Now let's say in this example, In this example, you restrict the size of the input. Let's say the size of the input is 4 rows or less. That means the input can be 2 rows, it can be 3 rows, and it can be 4 rows. Okay? Then what happens in this case? Well, what happens is since the input is restricted in its size, then the possibilities for the output are also restricted. Imagine if you have 2 rows, so it's either 0 and 0, 0 and 1, 1 and 0, 1 and 1. And so the hash of that would either be 0, 1, 1, or 0. So whenever you have a hash value of 1, you would know that the input was either 0, 1 or 1, 0. So if you restrict the size of the input, then the possibilities for the output are also restricted. This is not because of the structure of the hash function itself, it's actually because of the size of the input in this case. Now let's take an extreme example. Let's say you have a very secure hash function. Let's say we use SHA-3 that has 512 bits. A very secure hash function has strong collision resistance, is immune against birthday attack, and so on. However, let's say in this case, what you are hashing is the output of a coin flip that is either heads or tails. These are the only two possibilities of a coin flip. And so you would pass the result of this coin flip to the hash function, which is SHA-3. Unfortunately, you would only either get the hash of heads or the hash of tails in this case. These are the only two possibilities. You don't get anything else. So even though you have used a secure hash function, you are only ending up with two possibilities because the input size is reduced or is limited to only two possibilities in this case. So how do we actually deal with that? In many applications, this is the case. In many applications, the input space is restricted, and you would still want to use a hash function to ensure the integrity. Basically, if this coin flip is very important, you want to make sure that people know that the result was heads or tails, then you want to use a hash function to ensure that the coin flip was a legitimate one. And so how do we do that? Well, the hiding property comes in handy then. Basically, you take the result of the coin flip, let's say it's heads, but rather than hash this value, you concatenate it with a value R, where R is chosen from a probability distribution that has high minimum entropy, meaning that the result of this probability distribution, the random number itself, every number is equally likely to occur. Now, if you concatenate that, the hiding property would tell you that the result would mean that it is infeasible to find whether the concatenated value in this case was heads or tails. This is what the hiding property means. So if your hash function, which in this case is SHA-3, has the hiding property, then it means that even if the input space is restricted to just two values, heads or tails, if you concatenate this value with a random number R that is coming from a probability distribution that has high minimum entropy, it would be infeasible to find whether the input was heads or tails. Now, obviously, you have to generate a random number R, and this random number R has to come from a probability distribution that has high minimum entropy. This is actually the hiding property. Now, how is this used? Basically, one of the applications is something called commitments. Let's say you want to generate a value. Let's say it's a value X, and you want to commit to this value, meaning that you want to be able to tell people that you are the one that generated this value X. If X comes from a limited input space, then you would have the problem that we just explained. So what you do is you generate a nonce, a random number used only once, concatenated with X, and you generate the hash. But you keep this nonce secret. You keep R secret. And you just send the result of this hash. Now, how does this actually apply to commitments? Let's say later you want to prove to people that you were the one that generated this input value X. What do? You basically reveal the commitment value. You reveal the value R and you say, okay, because when you concatenate R with X, the result is this number, then I am the one who generated X. It is actually similar to creating a MAC using a hash of the password. If you remember, we said you can actually do that. You can pass to the hash function the message together with the password S, and the result will be a message authentication code in this case. No one would be able to generate the message authentication code unless they have the password or the key S in this case. This is a similar feature. So this is the first property that we have for hash functions to be used in blockchains, which is hiding. The second requirement is called puzzle friendliness. So a hash function h is said to be puzzle friendly if for every possible n-bit output value y, if k is chosen from a distribution with high minimum entropy, then it is infeasible to find x such that h of k concatenated with x is equal to y in time significantly less than 2 power n. Let's read it one more time. A hash function h is said to be puzzle friendly if for every possible n-bit output value y, it is chosen, if k is chosen from a distribution with high minimum entropy, then it is infeasible to find x such that h of k concatenated with x is equal to y in time significantly less than 2 power n. Okay, now what does this mean? Basically, let's say you want to set a target for your hash. Let's say you want the hash of something to be equal to y. Basically, you want to find this value such that the hash of this value is equal to y. Now, the puzzle friendliness requirement says that if you start with the value of y and you come up with a value k that is a random number chosen from a distribution with high minimum entropy, then it is actually infeasible to find a value x such that h of k concatenated with x is equal to y in a time significantly less than 2 power n. What this means is, in order to find the value x such that the result of the hash is y, you have to use brute force. This is basically what puzzle friendly is. So again, I will say, if you set a target for your hash function y, that means the result of the hash is equal to y. This is your starting point. So you want the hash of a value to be equal to y, and y is something that you determine. Okay? The puzzle friendliness property means that if you generate a random number k and you concatenate it with the value x such that the hash of k concatenated with x is equal to y, it is infeasible to find the value x that would result in y in a way other than brute force. So brute forces would be actually the only way to do that. Okay. The puzzle friendliness is used in cryptocurrencies or in blockchains because it allows you to set a target. This is actually what is used in mining. So in order for someone to generate a block, they have to collect a group of records, a group of, for example, financial transactions, and they have to find a value that is the hash of these transactions concatenated with the value x. But what they do is they set a target for this result to be less than y. And so puzzle friendliness means that you just have to try different values of x until you end up with a value of the hash that is less than y. This is basically puzzle friendliness, and we'll talk about it in more detail later in our discussion about cryptocurrencies. So these are basically the two requirements that we have for hash functions to be used in cryptocurrencies. We have hiding and we have puzzle friendliness. In addition to the 6 requirements that we already have, such as accepting any arbitrary size input, producing a fixed size output, one-way property, weak collision resistance, and strong collision resistance, and obviously being easy to compute. So all these requirements are needed for a hash function to be used in blockchains. Okay, the second cryptographic algorithm that we use in cryptocurrencies is something called a digital signature. And you can obviously guess that digital signatures become very important in blockchains, especially if the application is cryptocurrency. Because if you want to transfer money from one person to the other, you have to be able to guarantee or be able to validate this transaction. If Alice wishes to transfer money to Bob, Bob should be able to verify that Alice was the one who sent this money and be able to verify the amount of money that is being sent. And so digital signatures provide the ability to verify the author, date and time of signature, who basically generated the signature and when was it generated, and it authenticates the message content. And it can be verified by third parties to resolve disputes. So what's the difference between a digital signature and a message authentication code? Basically, we said that the message authentication code guarantees authentication and guarantees also integrity, okay? But it does not guarantee non-repudiation. And non-repudiation is when the originator is able to prove that they are the one who generated this message or this signature. Digital signatures achieve all three. They achieve authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation as well. And so basically what happens, as you see in this figure, you have a message. You pass this message to a digital signature algorithm together with the private key of the sender. The result is a signature. You concatenate the signature with the message, and then there is a digital verification algorithm that takes the message and takes the signature and takes also the public key of the sender and verifies whether the signature is valid or not. Okay. So what would be the requirements of a digital signature? They must be easy to produce. The private key must be unique to the sender and must be easy to recognize and verify and very difficult to forge. And by very difficult, we mean cryptographically difficult to forge in this case. Okay, so we will discuss a type of digital signature algorithm that is called the digital signature standard. It is similar to what is used in blockchains. Blockchains, or mainly Bitcoin, they use the elliptic curve cryptography version of the digital signature standard. But the digital signature standard is a widely used algorithm. It is used in many different applications other than blockchains, and it is the de facto standard to generate a digital signature. So we had discussed before a way to easily generate a digital signature. So in the figure labeled A, as you see here, you have a message, you generate the hash of the message, and you encrypt the message with the private key of the sender, for example, let's say using RSA. This is obviously a form of a digital signature because you have a hash, so you can guarantee integrity, and you have the private key that guarantees authentication and non-repudiation as well. And so at the receiver, you can verify by regenerating the hash and decrypting the hash with the public key of the sender. And if they match, then the message is verified. Now, the digital signature algorithm does something different. Basically, you take the message, you generate its hash, and you pass this hash to what is called a signature algorithm in this case. Now, this signature algorithm takes a group of parameters. It takes obviously the hash of the message. It takes also the private key of the sender. And it takes a random number or a nonce that is used only for this signature, used once and destroyed after that, and uses also a group of public parameters that are called the global public parameters. They're just a group of parameters such as the value of n in RSA that are input to the signature algorithm. The result are two values that are called S and R. These are concatenated with the message as we see here, and this is what gets sent. Now, the receiver receives the message and receives S and R. Now, the receiver would like to verify whether the message or S and R have been manipulated on its way. So what does the receiver do? They take the message and they feed it to the hash function once more, and they feed that to a verification algorithm. Together with what? Together with S and R, the public key of the sender, and the same global parameters that were used to generate the digital signature. And the verification algorithm in this case is different from a signature algorithm. They both are actually just based on mathematical equations that, as we will see, but they are actually different equations used to generate the signature and to do the verification. Basically, the result of the verification algorithm would tell you whether the message that has been sent matches the digital signature that is attached or not. Okay, now let's look at the math. Basically, I will just explain how the math works in DSA, and then I will give you a numerical example. So before you can actually generate a signature, you first have to generate the global parameters, and you have to generate the public and private key. So you have to generate the global parameters, PU of G, and you have to generate the private key X and the public key Y. So to generate the global public parameters, first you choose a large prime number P. Okay. Of course, the larger, the more secure it is. The recommendation is to use a P that is 1024 bits. And the recommendation in the digital signature standard is to have it a multiple of 64 bits. And this is for mainly hardware implementation. After you choose P, you choose Q, that is a prime factor of P minus 1. So you have now P and Q. P is a prime number, Q is a prime factor of P minus 1. You choose also a parameter H, where H is less than P minus 1, and you use H to generate the number G. So how do you do that? G is equal to H to the power of P minus 1 over Q. Since you chose Q to be a prime factor of P minus 1, then P minus 1 over Q would result in an integer. And so H to the power of P minus 1 over Q is an integer. You do H of P minus 1 over Q mod P, and this becomes the value of G. The three parameters P, Q, and G collectively are the global public parameters. So now you have the global public parameters. Next, you choose the public key and the private key. The private key is easy. You choose a number X that is less than Q, and then you use that to compute the public key in a way that is similar to what we saw in Diffie-Hellman. Basically, Y is equal to G to the power of X mod Q. Okay, and now you have the public key and the private key. Obviously, the public key is made public. Everyone knows it. The private key X is kept private. Okay, how do you generate a signature? Once you actually have a message M and you want to generate a signature of that message, first thing you do is that you generate a random signature key K. This is basically a random number used only once. It has to be less than Q. And then you compute the values R and S as we see here. R is equal to G to the power of K mod P mod Q. S is equal to the multiplicative inverse of K multiplied by H of M plus X multiplied by R, and all of this mod Q. So how do you generate a signature? First, you calculate R, and R is straightforward as you see in this equation. To generate S, first you take the private key and you multiply it with R that has been calculated in the previous equation. And then you add that to the value of the hash of the message M, and you multiply all of that to the multiplicative inverse of K mod Q. I will explain a little bit in an example how to calculate this multiplicative inverse, but this is basically how to calculate S. And the collective combination of R and S is actually the digital signature. You send both these values with M. If you take a look at R, you will find that R only depends on the global public key or the global public parameters and the value K. It is not dependent on the message at all and not dependent also on the private key. Okay, so what you can do is actually generate many values of R in advance. You don't have to wait for the message to generate that. Okay, the value of S is the one that actually depends on the message because you have the hash of the message, and depends as well on the private key X, and also depends on the random number K. Okay, so once you generate the signature, you can concatenate it with the message. How do you verify at the receiver? You take the message and you take the values of R and S that have been sent with the message. Okay, so what do? You compute the values in this equation. First, you compute the value W, that is S dash, the multiplicative inverse of S dash mod Q. What do we mean by S dash? Basically, when you send the message M concatenated with it R and S, all of these values can actually be manipulated. M can be manipulated, R can be manipulated, S can be manipulated. And so by the time it reaches the receiver, we say that it will be M dash, R dash, and S dash. Basically, we want to verify that M is equal to M dash, R is equal to R dash, S is equal to S dash. So To calculate W, you say we do the multiplicative inverse of S dash mod Q. And then you calculate the value of U1, which is basically you take the message that has been received, M dash, you calculate its hash, and you multiply it by W mod Q. And you calculate the value U2, which is R dash multiplied by W mod Q. And then you take the value of V, which is G to the power of U1 multiplied by Y to the power of U2 mod P, and everything is mod Q. Now, according to the math of DSA, if V is equal to R, the V is the value that is calculated here. If it is equal to R that has been sent with the message, then the signature is verified. Okay? There is a mathematical proof in the book. If you're interested to learn how this works, I will skip that for now. My bottom line is these are basically the calculations. If V that you calculate at the receiver matches R that has been calculated at the sender and sent with the message, then the signature is verified. You will note here that V depends on U1 and U2. It depends on the global parameters G, P, and Q, and depends also on the public key Y in this case. U1 and U2 depend on R and depend on the hash of the message. So to calculate V, which is supposed to match R, you would need the public key, you would need R, and you would need the hash of the message as well. So the verification would actually consider that the message is authentic in this case. And by including the public key in the verification V, you would know that the public key is the one that corresponds to the private key that was used to generate the message, that was used to generate the signature to begin with. Let's take a numerical example to see how this works. For a digital signature scheme based on DSS, assume that Q is equal to 101, P is equal to 7,879, H is equal to 3. Use these parameters to produce the digital signature for the message digest H of M equal to 22. Assume that the sender has chosen the private key X equals to 75 and that the generated pseudo-random integer K is equal to 50. So we have most of the global public parameters. We don't have the message itself, but we have the hash of the message, and this is enough. We don't actually need the message itself. We have the private key, but we don't have the public key, and we have the random number that would be used in the signature. And we want to use all of that to generate the signature and see how it is also verified. Okay. So the first step is key generation. We have missing in our global parameters G. So G is equal to H of P minus 1 over Q mod P. So H given in the question is actually 3, and it is to the power of P minus 1, which is 778 over 101 mod 7879. You will see that 778 over 101 is actually an integer, and the result of this expression is 170. So this is G. Once you calculate G, you can now calculate the public key Y. It is equal to G to the power of X mod P, which is 170, the result that you calculated before, to the power of 75. X is actually given in the question, mod 7,879, and the result is 4,567. So now that you have generated G and the public key, you can now generate the signature. We start by calculating R, which is equal to G to the power of K mod P mod Q. It's 170 to the power of 50 mod 7,879 mod 101, and the result of that is 95. Now we calculate S. S, as we said, is the multiplicative inverse of K mod Q multiplied by H of M plus XR. So as we said, we will take XR, multiply them together. This is 75 by 94. You add to that the hash, which is 22, and you multiply that by the multiplicative inverse of K minus 1 mod Q. So what remains now is to be able to calculate K minus 1, or the multiplicative inverse of K mod mod Q, which is 50 minus 1 mod 101. What does this mean? Basically, to calculate 50 power minus 1 mod 101, all you need to do is you find the value of 50 multiplied by D, such that when you do 50 multiplied by D mod 101, the result is 1. We have seen this in RSA. Basically, the multiplicative inverse of 50 mod 101 is the value where if you multiply it by 50 mod 101, the result would be 1. And we know that if you use the Euclidean algorithm, you can actually find the value of d easily in this case. So that's basically what you do. You use the Euclidean algorithm to find the d such that 50 multiplied by d mod 101 is equal to 1. And in our example, the result will be 99. So 99 is the multiplicative inverse of 50 mod 101. So you take 99, you multiply it here by this value, 22 plus 75 multiplied by 94, you take mod 101, the result is 97. And so the signature is 95 and 97. This is R and S. Okay. This signature is then sent with the message. And so to verify, you calculate these 4 parameters. You start with W, which is the multiplicative inverse of S mod Q. So S is the one that was sent with the message, which was 97. So 97 multiplicative inverse of 97 mod 101 is 95. And then you take the hash of the message, which is 22. You multiply it with W. So 22 by 25 mod 101 is 45. And then you use R and W to calculate U2. So it's 95 multiplied by 25 mod 101, which is 52. And then you calculate this expression. And if you get an expression that is equal to R, so if V is equal to R in this case, then the signature is verified. This is basically how the digital signature standard goes. Okay. So we'll stop the lecture here. So what we have learned today is the motivation behind blockchains. We have learned the basic components of a blockchain and what applications a blockchain actually serves. And we have learned also the main cryptography components of a blockchain. Next time, we will see how these components are grouped together to make an interesting blockchain application. Stay safe, and I hope you found this lecture beneficial and interesting. Thank you very much.